The virtual clinical trial, how AI is replacing animal and human testing, and what it means for drug prices. Let's talk about how a drug becomes a drug, because most people don't know, and the details are important for understanding what is changing. When a pharmaceutical company believes it has a compound that might work as a medicine, the journey from that initial belief to a drug you can buy at a pharmacy is extraordinarily long and extraordinarily expensive. The average timeline is somewhere between 10 and 15 years. The average cost is over $1 billion per drug that succeeds. And remember that 90% of candidates fail before they reach the market, so the real cost per approved drug, accounting for all the failures, is even higher. That cost is distributed across multiple stages of development. First, basic research to understand the disease mechanism and identify potential drug targets, the biological molecules or processes the drug might interfere with. Then preclinical testing, studies in cells and animals to see if the compound is safe and whether it appears to do what you hope it will do. Then 3 phases of clinical trials in humans. Phase 1 to establish safety and dosing. Phase 2 to look at effectiveness and side effects in a small patient population. Phase 3 to confirm effectiveness and monitor adverse reactions in a large patient population. Then regulatory review by agencies like the FDA, which can take a year or more on its own. Then manufacturing scale-up, distribution, and post-market surveillance. Each of those stages involves thousands of decisions, enormous amounts of data, and unavoidable uncertainty, and the costs accumulate relentlessly at every step. The piece of this process that is changing most dramatically right now, and that has the most interesting implications for drug prices, for the speed at which new treatments reach patients, and for the ethics of medical research, is the emergence of in silico trials. In silico is a Latin-derived term that means in silicon, as in computer chips. In silico trials are computerized simulations of clinical trials, virtual experiments that replace some or all of the physical testing that traditionally happens in animals and in humans. This sounds futuristic, and in its most advanced forms, it is. But the foundational technology that makes it possible already exists and is already being used. Let's start with what in silico trials actually are and how they work. At their core, in silico trials are based on the ability to build mathematical models of biological systems, organs, tissues, cells, molecular pathways, that are accurate enough to make useful predictions about how a drug will behave when it interacts with those systems. You're essentially building a simulation of the biology inside a person and then running the drug through that simulation to see what happens. This concept isn't entirely new. Computational models have been used in drug development for decades to predict things like how a drug molecule will be absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted by the body. What is new in 2026 is the level of sophistication those models have reached and the breadth of questions they can now address that used to require physical experiments. The development of generative AI for molecular design has been part of this. Generative AI models can design novel drug molecules from scratch, predicting their properties computationally before they are ever synthesized in a lab. The same types of models can also simulate how those molecules interact with proteins, with cellular signaling networks, and with physiological systems. But the most significant development for in silico trials specifically is the digital patient twin. A digital patient twin is a computational model of an individual patient, or of a simulated population of patients, that incorporates genetic information, demographic characteristics, disease characteristics, existing health conditions, and other relevant variables. Instead of enrolling a real patient in a trial and giving them a drug, you run the drug through the digital twin and observe the virtual outcome. AI is now being used to create these digital twins at a scale and level of biological realism that wasn't possible even a few years ago. Generative AI models create simulations of patient populations that represent the genetic diversity, age distribution, and clinical heterogeneity of the real patient populations that would be enrolled in an actual trial. Drug candidates can be tested against thousands or millions of these virtual patients in hours or days across a range of dosing scenarios, combination therapy options, and patient subgroups. The regulatory bodies that govern pharmaceutical development have been paying close attention to this. The FDA and the European Medicines Agency, EMA, have been developing clearer frameworks for how in silico evidence can be used in regulatory submissions. By the end of 2026, the expectation is that using virtual trial data to complement and reduce the size of traditional clinical trials will be an accepted part of the regulatory pathway for at least some types of drugs. The full replacement of human trials with in silico trials is not on the immediate horizon. The regulatory and scientific standards for that level of validation are not yet established, but the reduction and optimization of human trial requirements based on in silico evidence is already happening. This has significant implications for the cost and timeline of drug development. Clinical trials are the single largest cost center in pharmaceutical development. They require recruiting and screening large numbers of patients, which takes time and is expensive. They require monitoring patients over months or years, which is resource intensive. They fail at a high rate. Many drug candidates that look promising in phase 2 fail in phase 3 because the larger and more diverse patient population reveals problems that weren't apparent in the smaller phase 2 cohort. AI-powered in silico tools are attacking this cost and failure rate in several ways. First, by helping design better trials before they start, AI systems analyze existing clinical data to predict which patient populations are most likely to respond to a given drug, which biomarkers best predict response, and what dosing schedule is most likely to produce the desired effect. A trial designed with this kind of AI-assisted intelligence has a better chance of succeeding because it's targeting the right patients at the right dose with the right endpoints. Second, by reducing the size of trials needed to achieve statistical confidence. If in silico evidence from digital twin simulations is accepted as supplementary data, the number of real patients needed in a clinical trial to demonstrate safety and efficacy can be reduced. Fewer patients means lower cost and faster enrollment. Third, by catching likely failure earlier, AI systems can analyze emerging trial data in real time and identify signals that a drug is unlikely to succeed before the trial has run its full course. Stopping a failing trial early saves years and hundreds of millions of dollars that can be redirected to more promising candidates. One application worth discussing specifically is the use of AI to recruit the right patients for clinical trials. Recruitment has historically been one of the biggest bottlenecks in clinical trials. Finding and enrolling patients who meet the eligibility criteria, getting them to participate and retaining them through the full trial period is harder and slower than most people outside the industry realize. Trials routinely take 2 to 3 times longer than initially projected, simply because recruitment goes slower than expected. AI algorithms that analyze electronic health records, genomic data, and clinical characteristics to identify the most suitable patients have reduced trial initiation times by up to 50% in documented cases. That is not a minor improvement. In an industry where every month of development costs millions of dollars and delays the point at which patients can benefit, cutting initiation time by 50% is transformative. Now let's talk about the animal testing question, because it's one that resonates beyond the pharmaceutical industry. Animal testing is legally required for most drug development pathways before human trials can begin. The requirement exists because it has historically been the best available way to establish basic safety, to demonstrate that a compound doesn't cause obvious organ toxicity, doesn't damage DNA, doesn't cross the placental barrier in dangerous ways, before exposing humans to it. But animal testing has well-established limitations. Animals are not humans. The correlation between what happens in rodent experiments and what happens in humans is imperfect, which is part of why so many drug candidates that look safe and effective in animals turn out to be unsafe or ineffective in humans. Animal testing is also time-consuming, expensive, and raises genuine ethical concerns that have grown more prominent in public discourse over the last decade. In silico trials that can predict safety profiles computationally with enough accuracy to satisfy regulatory standards offer a pathway to reducing and eventually replacing much animal testing. This is not imminent for all applications, but it is an explicit goal of regulators in Europe. The EU has a stated regulatory ambition to phase out mandatory animal testing for cosmetics and is developing frameworks for how computational evidence can substitute for animal studies in pharmaceutical development as well. The moral dimension of this is one that the video on this topic should address directly. If in silico trials can reliably predict what animal trials predict, the case for continuing to subject animals to pharmaceutical testing becomes harder to make. And the reduction in animal use is not just ethically significant, it is also a practical accelerant for the industry. In silico experiments run in hours, animal studies take months. Every step of the development process that can be moved to a computer screen is a step that costs less and takes less time. What does all of this mean for drug prices? That is the question most people watching care about most directly. The honest answer is that lower development costs do not automatically translate into lower drug prices for patients. The pharmaceutical industry operates in a complex market with patent protections, insurance negotiations, lobbying dynamics, and pricing strategies that are influenced by far more than just the cost of development. Companies that reduce their development costs using AI may choose to maintain prices and increase profits, or they may face competitive pressure from other companies doing the same thing that eventually drives prices down. Or they may direct savings into developing drugs for diseases that have historically been too unprofitable to pursue because of small patient populations. That last point, drugs for diseases with small patient populations, what the industry calls rare diseases or orphan diseases, is where the in silico revolution may have its most dramatic near-term impact. The economics of developing a drug for a disease that affects 50,000 people globally have never made sense under the traditional development model. $1 billion development cost divided across 50,000 patients means an astronomical per-patient price. But if AI and in silico methods can reduce the development cost by 70 or 80%, the economics of rare disease drug development begin to shift in ways that make previously unpursued diseases viable targets. We are already seeing the early evidence of this in gene editing therapies, like the one developed for baby KJ, which we covered in a previous video. The ability to design a personalized genetic treatment in 6 months instead of years is only possible because the development process has been radically compressed by AI tools. And as those tools mature, the cost of that compression is going to fall. For investors looking at this space, the in silico trial and digital twin segment is one of the most actively funded areas of health technology. Companies like Unlearn.ai, which focuses specifically on AI-powered control arm simulation for clinical trials, and in silico medicine, which uses AI across the drug discovery and development pipeline, are early examples of what is becoming a substantial industry. Certara, which provides biosimulation and regulatory science software to pharmaceutical companies, is publicly traded and represents a more established entry point into the sector. For people building careers, regulatory affairs in AI pharmaceutical development is an emerging specialty with very limited talent and very high demand. The people who understand both the scientific standards required for AI evidence in regulatory submissions and the regulatory frameworks being developed by the FDA and EMA are going to be extraordinarily valuable. Computational biology, the application of mathematical and computational tools to biological questions, is another field where demand is outpacing supply significantly. The in silico trial is not a complete replacement for physical trials yet. The regulatory frameworks are still being developed. The validation science is still maturing. There are aspects of drug safety and human variability that are genuinely difficult to model computationally with the level of confidence regulators require. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. The pharmaceutical development pipeline of 10 years from now will look fundamentally different from the one of today. More computation, less animal testing, faster trials with smaller cohorts supplemented by virtual data, earlier and better decisions about which candidates to pursue and which to abandon, and potentially, not certainly, but potentially, faster access to new medicines at costs that more patients and more healthcare systems can afford. The simulation of a patient is not a patient, but it may be the key to getting medicines to patients faster, more safely, and more affordably than anything that has come before it. Subscribe if you want to follow this story as it develops. We've been covering the full scope of AI in medicine across this series, from cancer detection to drug discovery to clinical care to careers. Every one of these videos adds a piece to the picture. Share this one with someone who's been frustrated by the cost of medicine, because this is the part of the story that most directly speaks to that frustration, and it's happening right now.